Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Our main story for this week looks at the latest installment from the Garmin RunSafe studies and how this study of over 7,000 runners can help us reduce our risk of running injuries. Then we dive into the latest expert-backed research on plant-based diets and talk about a certain type of research paper that can help you be incredibly informed while skipping all the jargon and confusion that academic studies often contain. And we finish off the show with a roundup of some of the best well-being related things from the past week. I'm your host, Jesse Bourgeois. Welcome to the Wellbeing Weekly Show. Let's get into it. In 2019, Garmin, known for their running and GPS watches, partnered with RunSafe, which is a research group based out of a university in Denmark. The idea was that Garmin's got the data and the ability to reach a whole lot of runners, and RunSafe has the academic expertise to properly analyze that data. So they joined forces with the goal to better understand running-related injuries, including why they occur and how we can prevent them from happening in the first place. Last year in 2024, they released the first installment of this study. They looked at how many people got injured after getting to 1,000 kilometers and then 2,000 kilometers over the course of about 18 months. For context, if you run around 20 kilometers per week, you get to 1,000 kilometers in about 1 year. So at this 1,000 kilometer follow-up, over half of the 7,000 runners in the study had sustained an injury, 57.6%. At the 2,000 kilometer follow-up, 69.8% had been injured. So if you're a runner or thinking about getting into running, this study suggests your risk of injury is basically the flip of a coin, actually a bit worse. Which leads us into their second installment of this study series that just came out this month. In it, they looked at what predicts an injury to occur and how that might help us figure out how to best avoid one. And the results might surprise you. Those who ran more than 105 kilometers per week, who ran 7 days per week, had the least risk of injury, along with those who followed a structured running plan. Those with the highest risk of injury were those with less than 1 year of running experience or more than 40 years experience, those who ran less than 2 times per week, who ran less than 25 kilometers per week, and those who did not use a structured running program. So in other words, for the most part, it's beginners. Beginners who are just getting started have the highest risk of injury. A 2024 systematic review published in the Journal of Sport Health Science looked at 148 studies and found something similar. They found that running 1 day per week or less, running less than 2 hours per week, and more days off between sessions all contributed to increased running-related injuries, alongside a handful of other risk factors such as previous injuries, poor mobility, and more. All of this can sound a bit discouraging and be a bit discouraging if you're one of the folks who does experience an injury when getting into running. Running has so many benefits and can contribute to our well-being in a variety of ways. A review of 116 studies found running improves both mood and overall mental health. And there is a large, growing body of research showing numerous benefits to health. But one study in particular that I think about often is this paper by Lee and colleagues. They looked at over 55,000 adults and found that persistent runners have a 29% reduction in all-cause mortality and a 50% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality. And this makes pretty good sense. Comparing studies can be tough, but when you have statistics and outcomes that match, you can do apples to apples comparisons, which is super helpful when you're trying to compare what has a bigger impact on health and well-being. And we're able to do that pretty well with a few things in relation to all-cause mortality, which just means death by any cause. Studies that use hazard ratios and look at all-cause mortality highlight that cardiovascular fitness is by far the most important thing for reducing our risk of mortality. So activities like running are going to be great options for improving health and well-being. There are many reasons to get into running, from how accessible it is, just needing a pair of shoes and you're off, to the endorphins, to the overall health benefits. But this flip of a coin risk puts a bit of a damper on the whole thing. So what can we do? There are 3 primary things that both the research and reputable running coaches both agree lowers the risk of injuries, especially for those of us who are newer to running. The first is progressive overload. Here's how I like to think about it, and bear with me, I promise it will make sense at the end. Imagine you're baking cookies. There are 2 variables to keep in mind to bake your cookies: how hot your oven is and how long you leave the cookies in for. If the oven is really hot, really intense, then the cookies don't need to be in the oven for very long, and if you leave them in too long, they're going to burn. If the oven isn't very hot at all, the cookies are going to need to be in there for a really long time and might never fully cook if the oven is only just above room temperature. Cardiovascular exercise and running in particular is similar to this. If you run at a really high intensity, you won't be able to run very much until you've reached your limit, and any more would cause injury or cause you to get burned. If you run at a really, really low intensity, like walking, you will need to spend a lot of time running to make progress. The goal is to know what kind of cookie you are and what balance of time and intensity will allow you to be properly baked. You get the idea. The goal is to avoid getting burnt, but to do enough to get the benefits. And as we get more and more fit, we can handle more and more time and intensity. This is the idea of progressive overload, or what you may have heard of as the stimulus recovery adaptation curve. It looks like this. Each bout of exercise is a stress on the body. Afterwards, you recover and your body adapts, allowing you to handle a bit more of a stressor. Do this hundreds of times and you get progressively fitter and fitter. The trap most people fall into is they either don't give enough time to recover and adapt and slowly sink further and further into the hole and end up getting injured. Or they space out the exercise bouts too far and think they've adapted and can do more intensity when really they waited too long and ended up back at their baseline. And now the higher intensity that they're trying to do, they can't handle. So the key here is to follow a thoughtful progressive training program that allows adequate rest and recovery, but a high enough frequency with appropriate intensity to progress. It sounds complicated, but it really doesn't have to be. Going too slow is less risky than too hot. If the cookies have been in the oven for a while and you look and they're still doughy, you can crank up the heat a bit and all will be fine. But if you went too hot and go look and the cookies are totally burnt, there's no going back. It's the difference between it feeling too easy and you could do more versus you're already injured because you went too hard. There's no singular recommendation that can really be given here since it's so subjective and unique to you. For some, this might look like going for walks 3 to 5 times per week and building up to a jog over time. For others, they might be able to begin with some slow running a few times per week right away. It all depends. That said, a segment we're going to be doing on this channel is well-being case studies. In the description, there's a form you can fill out that asks some questions about your goals, and we will make videos going through how we would create a well-being plan based on that information. We won't use full names, but rather initials to keep some anonymity. So if you're interested in running and want to know how a specific plan could be built for you, fill out the form, and if there are a few that are similar, we will use one as an example and get into more of the practical aspects. But one common example that comes up often is to increase your volume or how much you run by 10% per week. That's fine. It's nothing magical. It's just a good approach to take it slow. Other things include general physiological monitoring. Does any lingering soreness or achiness go away during your warm-up? Is your resting heart rate at baseline or getting lower over time? If it is starting to sit a bit high, it could indicate your body is feeling a bit under-recovered. Progressive overload is the first thing we can do to ensure we're approaching our running in a thoughtful way and reduce injury. Number 2 is strength training. There have been mixed results with strength training, so you might see running coaches saying it doesn't help, but if we dig into that research a little bit, there's some tells that might suggest why it doesn't always show a benefit. This systematic review and meta-analysis from 2024 concluded that, quote, exercise-based interventions do not appear to reduce the risk of running-related injuries. But of the studies included, those where the exercise intervention was supervised did reduce the risk of injury. So the problem might not be strength training itself, but rather how runners are going about it. Running and strength training are really different in how you approach them and how they feel, and that can be a bit strange when crossing over from one to the other. Running is that sort of slow burn with no muscular failure really, whereas resistance training or strength training is short, intense muscular efforts which just feel different. The best thing a runner can do here is learn how to properly strength train. And the win-win here is resistance training will benefit your running, but also just your overall quality of life. And the third thing we can do to reduce injury, and it's related to number 1, is to follow a proper plan. Going by feel can work, but having a thoughtful plan in place to keep you from getting overzealous or from holding back too much can help you from getting injured. This is where working with a coach or trying out a high-quality coach to 5K program can be beneficial. There are a lot of other things that can help that are more just general healthy lifestyle principles like getting a good sleep and eating a nutritious diet. And speaking of nutritious diets, our secondary story this week is about a brand new position statement published by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. There are 2 main reasons I want to talk about this in this week's show. The first is, it's interesting, and it contains some really informative key points, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the second is to highlight how valuable position stand papers are for us non academics. Position papers are an argument or opinion put forward by an organization about a particular topic or issue. And what's so great about them is it's usually organizations that are both in the academic and research world and the practical application side of things. So the position they hold is usually very applicable to the average person or demographic the position paper states. And since it's presented as an argument, it usually summarizes all of the best research, but not as just a parodying of that research, but how it fits into a solid rationale for or against certain recommendations. They also are often void of a lot of technical jargon that can be a part of academic papers and are usually pretty easy to read through, and you end up being up to speed on the majority of the most notable research on a topic. They're just a great way to understand the research and nuance in a practical way about a scientific topic. Obviously, there can still be bias and issues, but overall, they're pretty fantastic. I would be cautious with position papers put forward by individual researchers and stick to group published position papers instead. And they're usually open source, meaning you don't have to try to find your way around a paywall in order to read them. So all of that said, let's get into this position paper about vegetarian and vegan diets by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is the largest organization of food and nutrition professionals in the world. It starts with the abstract, which is just a summary of the paper. It gives you an idea of what's to come. Then it goes into the position statement, or in other words, the argument that the group is putting forward. And then the rest of the paper will be the defense of this claim. Typically, the first couple sentences after the abstract provide the position statement. And then the rest of this section is sort of context around that position, the objectives they're trying to put forward through the paper, which is usually around helping healthcare providers or professionals working in the field, and then summarizing what they're going to be talking about. For this paper, the first sentence of this section states their position, saying, quote, "In adults, appropriately planned vegetarian and vegan dietary patterns can be nutritionally adequate and can offer long-term health benefits, such as improving health outcomes associated with cardiometabolic diseases." The next section talks about the process behind the creation of this position paper, followed by a summary of the evidence. There's really 3 key points that come out of that summary. First, a plant-based diet, be it vegetarian or vegan, is great for cardiovascular health. That's really where it shines the most. Second, it's also beneficial for things like cancer and metabolic conditions like diabetes, but not quite as significantly compared to the cardiovascular disease benefits. And third, that there doesn't seem to be any clinical issues that result as a consequence of a vegetarian or vegan diet. So it's a lot of benefit without a lot of risk. There are some, quote, low or very low quality evidence to suggest concerns around B12 and bone health, but both can be mitigated quite easily with proper planning. The rest of this paper is around the importance of food quality, macronutrient and micronutrient considerations, and then how nutrition professionals can help facilitate these dietary patterns. Nothing earth-shattering here, but there is some things that are worth noting. No matter your dietary pattern, quality is always something to prioritize. Choosing whole, nutrient-dense foods the majority of the time and keeping highly processed foods as a once in a while is key to long-term healthy nutrition. This is because these processed foods typically strip away the fiber and add in sugars and salt and things like that. Processing isn't just bad in itself, it's what the processing is doing to the food that can be problematic. But not always. And the authors do point out that, quote, "However, even processed plant-based milk and meat alternatives tend to be higher in fiber and lower in saturated fat and cholesterol compared to animal-based products, which can be beneficial to heart health." This is something we talked about last week too. In general, ultra-processed foods tend to be less health promoting, but it's a compared to what question. If the ultra-processed food has a bunch of fiber and is low in saturated fat, and you're comparing that to something that's unprocessed, but that has no fiber and is high in saturated fat, then the processed option might actually be more health promoting. Other notable comments are that vegetarian and vegan diets can benefit the gut, something typical with dietary patterns high in fiber, and in particular, prebiotics. That it's important to consume a variety of plant-based protein sources, but overall, protein isn't much of a concern. This is something we will talk about more soon on this show. That soy is not just safe, but is associated with cardiovascular benefits and a lower risk of various cancers. That supplementing with an algae oil for omega-3s is fine, but not necessarily an essential thing to do, which I thought was interesting. That calcium-fortified foods are recommended, like orange juice or plant-based milks, alongside dark leafy greens. The importance of iodine and using something like an iodized salt, and that iron can be a concern, but not always. But a good recommendation is to pair iron-rich plant-based foods with vitamin C, which enhances its absorption. Not included, but worth noting, is that if you supplementing every other day rather than daily can increase absorption. And how B12 and vitamin D are nutrients that may be best suited to get through some form of supplementation for vegetarians and vegans. Again, nothing really new here to those of us who have been paying attention to plant-based dietary patterns for the past while, but it is a great summary paper for nutrition professionals to read and study. But also, for those of us who are just interested in trying to create a dietary pattern that works for our unique needs and well-being. Now let's move in to our Wellbeing Round-Up, where we take a look at some of the good, the bad, the funny, and the frustrating in the realm of well-being. First, the podcast of the week to check out is Simon Hill's podcast, The Proof. He recently did an episode number 352, with Drew Harrisberg. That was a bit of a research review looking at 4 recently published studies. But the reason I bring it up today is at the start of the episode, they talk about how health podcasts have become a problem in that they tend to choose guests based on virality and the likelihood of getting a lot of views, rather than prioritizing actual high-quality content and highly educated and professional guests that genuinely know what they're talking about. Health podcasts have largely fallen victim to the games of social media, where controversial and sensationalized content tends to get a lot of views and engagement, whereas something that is maybe less exciting but actually accurate doesn't get the same attention. As a result, some of these podcasts are playing the game and bringing on guests and providing a platform for this sensationalized and sometimes straight up false information to be presented. It's a big reason I do this weekly podcast segment, to try to help you identify high quality podcasts that aren't going to feed you misinformation or dramatized content designed to get clicks without your well-being as a priority. Simon Hill's podcast is one of the few health-related podcasts with integrity, and I highly recommend checking it out. This week, I also came across this on Instagram, and I'm speechless. Take a look.
Vegetables do not exist. And I know what you're all thinking here. Vic, I'm holding a vegetable in my hand. I know that vegetables exist. Really? Name a vegetable.
Pepper.
Celery. Celery is a stalk.
What about pepper?
Pepper is a fruit.
Grape. What?
Grape is a fruit.
All right, well, apple.
Potato.
That is.
What was that?
Potato.
Potato is a tuber.
Broccoli.
Broccoli
Spinach.
is a flower.
Spinach.
Spinach is a, say it with me, leaf. Listen, I am first and foremost a person of science. And what does the science tell us? Botanists say that there is no scientific definition of a vegetable, right? Okay, so then we're asking ourselves, Vic, how do I know that word? A great question. It is a culinary term. See, fruits, for example, do have a scientific definition.
Sorry, it's a rabbit.
Reverse ratatouille.
Reverse ratatouille.
Oh, it's a reverse ratatouille.
It's a manatouille.
Manatouille, someone said.
Is this a very large rat or a very...
I'm pretty sure she's right. This sent me down such a rabbit hole. We might have to do a whole show on this at some point. My life is a lie. Lastly, let's get a little meta. What is well-being? Probably apparent given this show, but the concept of well-being is something of great interest to me, but is a bit of a disparate topic. Cambridge professor in the philosophy of science, Anna Alexandrova, talks about how the science of well-being has what she refers to as construct pluralism, meaning that various fields of academia have different theories, constructs, and measures of well-being. In psychology, well-being can be measured by using happiness scales, the satisfaction with life scale, and things like the Edinburgh Mental Well-Being Scale. In economics, things like GDP and household income and consumption might be used to talk about well-being. In developmental sciences and medical sciences, you have quality of life scales like the Human Development Index and health-related quality of life scale, which are all interesting and fascinating, but is also why the science of well-being, I think, needs to be accompanied by the art or philosophical inquiry of well-being as well. Not just exploring the mechanisms of well-being, but also the meaning of well-being. If you were to start thinking about your own well-being, you might naturally start to include all of these different models in what makes for a meaningful experience of well-being for you. That your well-being related to nutrition, for example, might include health and the health-related quality of life. It might include being aligned with your budget or your household income and consumption. It might include being of subjective satisfaction, such as taste and be a part of your subjective happiness scale. And many, if not all, areas of our life are like this. They're contextual, and our well-being is difficult to distill into one particular area or measurement of science. It's why I wanted this to be the well-being show and not just the health and fitness show. There's a certain quality of life that can be missed if we're simply trying to optimize health and fitness. One of our ongoing goals with this show will be to explore that quality and dive into the meaning of well-being as it applies to various topics, keeping it practical but hopefully thoughtful. One way we can explore that effectively on this show is through well-being case studies. So if you're interested, do fill out the form in the description for a chance to have your well-being related goal or situation used as the case study. And now, to lighten the mood, because we can't take this all too seriously, I leave you with this.